So we're live.
Not quite. Processing.
There'll be this moment where I'm on Facebook and I'm like staring at my computer like Cindy Brady.
Mine says we're live.
Are we live?
That's what mine says, but
It says we're live.
Not quite yet. Hasn't shown up yet. There's always a little bit of a lag.
live.
It says we're live on Facebook.
Yeah, we've been on for a minute.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, let's go for it.
Let me, oh, you know.
Hi. All right, good evening. Hello, Quarantine Book Club. We are so excited tonight. We have Eddy, is it Boudel?
It is.
Boudel Tan,
exactly it.
Author of After Elias, and my co-admin Susan Harper is with me tonight. So I'm going to start off because our behind the scenes people who help us are Amy and Nancy Harrington with the Passionistas Project. And today's live event is hosted by Amy and Nancy Harrington, sisters who founded the Passionistas Project to inspire women to follow their passions through their podcast, regular live events, and a subscription box filled with products from women-owned businesses and female artisans. The theme of the spring box, which goes on sale next week, is Passionistas for the Planet and contains eco-friendly items to help you reduce your carbon footprint. You can subscribe to the box and find out about all of the programs at thepassionistasproject.com. Amy or Nancy, please post a link into the comment section so people can find that if they're interested. Welcome, Eddy. Eddy Boudel Tan's work depicts a world much like our own. The heroes are flawed, truth is distorted, and there is as much hope as there is heartbreak. His second novel, The Rebellious Tide, is coming this summer, and his short fiction and nonfiction can be found in journals such as Gertrude, the G&LR, and Yoke Literary. When he isn't plotting his next story or adventure abroad, he serves home-cooked meals to those living on the streets as co-founder of the Sidewalk Supper Project. He lives with his husband in Vancouver. Welcome, Eddy. We're so happy to have you here. We have just totally enjoyed your book this month. So many people have read it. And so I start off every interview asking the same questions because you debuted in 2020, which as we don't even need to say it. It was a year. It was a year. So when did you start writing After Elias?
I started writing in January 2017. I actually remember this really clearly because for some reason, January has this magical quality that gets me really inspired to just do things. So I started writing pen to paper then. And it took a few months to kind of, write the story. But before then, I had spent quite a bit of time just kind of conceptualizing what I wanted to write, decide what story I wanted to write and outlining what that would look like. But yeah, I can't believe it's been 4 years ago now. So it's really incredible to see it out in the world, being read and held in people's hands.
I know, isn't that fun? Like to see people holding your book. It's like,
it never gets old.
I know, it's really fun. So in your bio, it says that you've written nonfiction. Did you start out as a nonfiction writer or do you vacillate between the two?
I've always been more of a fiction writer, I think. I've been writing since I was a kid. And I think the thing that really draws me to writing is the storytelling aspect of it, right? Just, providing some sort of escape for myself and for the reader and just creating places that don't exist and people that don't exist. But I think you could take a lot of storytelling to our realities as well. So the fiction that I do write is, it tends to be kind of focused on areas of my life or experiences in my life that I think might be interesting to people, but it's all about telling a story. So whether it's, real or imagined, there's still kind of a storytelling aspect to it.
Totally. I started out,
Yeah.
my heart is with nonfiction, and I think that all nonfiction can be told in a way that reads just like fiction, but it's real,
Totally.
you know?
Yeah.
So where did the idea for this book come from?
Okay. This might sound a little morbid, and I think a lot of the people viewing have probably read the book, so hopefully you have a bit of context around what I'm saying. But I think ultimately what I wanted to tell a story about the fear of losing everything. And it comes from a personal place for me because, you know, with every accomplishment that I have achieved and as far in life as I've come, I've always had this lingering fear that I'm just one misstep from losing it all. Like just make one mistake and it can just vanish. And I still kind of struggle with that. So I wanted to tell a story that spoke to that. And how I chose to tell that story was to take a person who appears to have it all, you know, at least at the surface, and that character is Cohen. And I wanted to take everything away from him in the most heartbreaking and spectacular manner. And I didn't want to do that out of malice or cruelty, but I wanted to do that to illustrate what happens to oneself when you do lose everything, when you're confronted with the prospect of being left with nothing and the future that you had imagined for yourself being taken away. I think one learns a lot about themselves, as Cohen does in the story.
Cool. Yeah. The book is a lot about grief, and I think that's why it resonated so much with me, is because I'm grieving the loss of my mother and stepfather, and I don't know, it rang true for me. I mean, I have nothing in common, you know, with the situation, but the idea of grief and how that feels, definitely, I felt that. How long did it take you to get an agent for this manuscript?
It took me, oh boy. Well, I was one of those overeager writers who started querying agents way earlier than I should have. Like I sometimes look at that very first query letter that I sent to an agent and it makes me cringe because I basically did everything that you're not supposed to do that I didn't realize at the time. So if you count that very first terrible query letter, it took about 7 months or so. But then I realized I had to, you know, reassess my approach here. So I spent a lot of time just doing my homework and figuring out how to land a literary agent. So I count myself really lucky because it didn't take a lot of time. I know of writers who, you know, took years for them to find an agent, and writers who still haven't been able to find one. And I really think there's no secret sauce. There's no magic recipe. It's just, you know, there's a lot of luck and timing involved in this process, which can be hard to swallow. But I count myself as one of the lucky ones, so I feel very fortunate. And I think what's most important, and I often tell younger writers this, what's really important is not just about publishing a book. Like that obviously is an obvious goal for a lot of authors, but the way to get there really involves aligning yourself with the right people. So if you want to be traditionally published, what's most important is to find the people who believe in your work and believe in you as a writer and your talent and what you have to say. So I feel really lucky, not just that I got an agent, but I feel like I found the right agent. I found an agent who kind of got me, you know, and really felt passionately about my book. So when it came down to, you know, deciding whether or not I wanted to sign with her, it was a no-brainer because I felt like it was the right fit. And I think that's really important when authors are looking for agents or editors or publishers to ensure that they're, you know, connecting with the right people who can sort of do your work justice.
I wholeheartedly agree. As someone who's had two agents, they were both nice people, but I just don't feel like they were the right fit. You know,
Yeah.
and that happens. So yeah, you do want to find someone who actually gets you and wants to support your career. How long did it take to sell to a publisher once it went out on submission?
So that took a while. It took 11 months. So I was on submission for 11 months, and it was probably the most stressful 11 months of my life because for anyone who's gone through this process, it's really harrowing because you feel like, all right, I've got an agent. It's in the bag. Like, there's no way this is not going to sell. and so you are riding this wave of optimism, and you can imagine, you know, the dreams, all your dreams is coming true. New York Times bestseller list, and everything that comes with it. Like, it's so
Yeah.
hard to not go there, right? But then the rejections start coming in, and the rejections are, we don't even call them rejections, they're called passes, but they're always worded so beautifully, and they're always so gentle, and for each, you know, editor who ultimately decides against taking on the work, you know, there's usually, you know, one or two real important elements in that they didn't connect with. And one thing that I learned quickly is, you know, it's so subjective, right? So every agent, every editor, everyone in the industry, they're a reader first, so they have their own preferences, and they're either going to connect with the story or they won't. And that's just the reality of it. So it took 11 months. So again, the same with my agent. I felt really privileged to find a publisher who really felt strongly about my work. So when it came down to, you know, sorting out offers and whatnot, it was, again, like a no-brainer for me, because just with that initial conversation, I could just tell how they understood the story, and they connected with the story the way that I hoped readers would.
Cool. That's awesome. So what did you have planned for your book launch?
What did I have planned?
Yeah. Did you have like big plans? Like, this is what's going to happen?
I did, yes. And none of which actually happened. So yeah, I was, again, really overeager because I planned my book launch, I think it was about 9 months out. So this was about this time last year. So before the pandemic really got real, you know, I heard rumblings of this happening around the world, but it just hadn't, I'm from Vancouver, and it just hadn't hit home yet. So what I had done was I booked this vintage tiki bar in Vancouver. So anyone who's been to Vancouver, there's this hotel called the Waldorf, and it's beautiful. It's this vintage hotel, really cool. It's been around since the 50s or 60s, and it's really retained that aesthetic. And there's a bar there. It's a tiki themed bar that I rented out for the party. And it was perfect, the perfect venue, because it actually inspired one of the settings in the book. For those who've read it, Casa Paraiso, it's a motel on a roadside in Mexico that some of the characters find themselves in during a storm. And that was actually inspired by this hotel or motel. So it was a perfect venue. So, you know, lo and behold, I wasn't able to do that. I had plans of, I was going to dress the bartenders up as pilots, and we were going to have, you know, a photo booth with a backdrop of, you know, a beautiful tropical island, and we had live music. I got this really cool local musician to come and perform. So none of that happened. But you know what? I ended up having an amazing virtual launch party in September, and I loved it. It was all done virtually, all online, but it was incredible because I had people join from Indonesia or
Wow.
New Jersey, or yeah, from all over the place. And people joined who wouldn't have been able to do it if it were done in person. So I count it, you know, I'm a bit of an optimist in that way. So that's my silver lining there. But I honestly, genuinely had such an amazing time launching this book. Like I just felt the joy and the relief in a way too that it was able to get launched, because even that was up in the air for a little while during the depths of the pandemic in the spring. So it was a joyful occasion nonetheless.
That's cool. Before Susan asks some of the questions that she has for you, I wanted to ask you a little bit to tell our members about your Sidewalk Supper project. I'm curious about that.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, the Sidewalk Supper project is, I call it a community initiative in which we serve home cooked meals to people living on the streets. And it came out of this idea. So my best friend and I, we're kind of foodies, you know, like we love hosting dinner parties. My husband as well. But it was me and my best friend who kind of came up with this idea. We were just having dinner one night, just, you know, at a restaurant. And we started thinking like how cool it would be, how interesting it would be to take our love of food and conversation and bring that to people on the streets. So I live in Vancouver. It's a beautiful city and a lot of positive things, but we have a very terrible and shameful homelessness crisis. The cost of living here is insane. And what ends up happening is a lot of people on the margins of society end up living on the streets. There's actually a pretty high percentage of people in Vancouver who are just one paycheck away from actually being homeless. So it's a huge problem here. And even in my neighborhood, I live right downtown in the center of the city, and we have, a lot of neighbors who are living on the streets that we see every day, in the same corners, in the same pockets. So that was the idea. And it wasn't just about solving hunger, like that wasn't really the point. Of course, a lot of these people are hungry and they need food. But the reality is there are a lot of ways for these people to find food. They scavenge, they get money from people passing by. There are a lot of organizations that are able to put food in their hands at a large scale. What we wanted to do was to connect more closely with these people on the streets and kind of share our love of food with them through home cooked meals. So what we would do is we would whip up a meal at home, just like we would if we were actually having friends over, and we would package it up and we would bring it out on the streets and share it with them. And it was as much about like having a conversation with people and sharing, our love of food with them. So it's been a really amazing experience. It's been happening for 4 years now. And we've met so many people. I wrote a series of articles called Stories from the Sidewalk. And the goal of that was to share their stories with our readership. Because what we learned was, these are people, like they're people who have the same, hopes and dreams and preferences and fears and whatnot as we do. And the one thing that we saw in common with people that we encountered on the streets is the absence or presence of a safety network. I think the one main thing that might be seen as differentiating someone like myself from someone on the streets is that if I were to lose my job or if I were to, meet some sort of disaster, I'd have a safety network. I have people and I have systems and I have a family that I can lean on. And for a lot of these people that we've met, that just isn't quite the case. A lot of these people come from foster care. A lot of these people come from Indigenous communities that are affected by a whole number of social and systemic issues. So that's something that we really, really learned, and we really wanted to share their stories with people to help, improve empathy and understanding of the crisis that we have in our city.
So are you cooking these meals or like,
Yep.
I mean, I imagine that you're cooking a lot because, I mean, are you just like I'm making a, one thing of lasagna and I'm going to bring it out, or are you doing it large scale?
So we keep it. Me and my best friend, we both have pretty small apartments and pretty small kitchens. So we can't produce meals en masse. We typically do about 15 meals or 15 portions per meal. So we would, figure out what the recipe would be and we would cook it up ourselves and just package it ourselves. We also have volunteers help us. So we get volunteers, either, people who we meet in the community or even friends come in and they help us package things up and bring it out on the streets. So yeah, we cook it all up ourselves. Yeah, made with love.
Wow, that's pretty cool. I'm assuming you're a good cook, right?
I don't know. Depends on who you ask. I do cook, but I don't know if I like to experiment with things. So sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I tend to play it safe when we do a sidewalk supper. We stick to the classics. We do, like roast chicken, or we do lasagna, stuff like that everyone loves. So
okay, you're not like, we're gonna have liver and onions tonight for everyone.
Yeah, I don't know how that would be. Yeah, nuts.
Yeah.
I don't know.
You don't want to do that.
No.
Okay,
That's
Susan.
horrible to act on your wondering of what it would be like to feed the homeless and then to act on it. That's really admirable. And when you said people are one paycheck away from being homeless, what really gets me about homelessness is trying to get them off the streets. It's like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. It doesn't often happen. So it's good that you're having conversations. I'm impressed.
Yeah, it's a really complicated issue and there's no simple solution. Absolutely. And I think, to your point, I think there needs to be the people who, are in that situation need to want to change their situation, but then they need to feel like they have a chance at doing that. So what we found is for someone who doesn't have a job, who's living on the streets, how do they get a job? How do they just walk into a place and apply for a job? There may be programs in place that can help them, but how do they even access those programs without, access to technology and other resources? So it's very, it's a complicated, tough situation.
Yep.
Okay, good for you. All right, are we ready to start book questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's do it.
What I always start with is, what did you read as a kid? What was your, because I was an elementary teacher for 25 years. So I want to know what you were like as a reader. Or
I actually read, well, I wrote a lot of the things that were inspired by what I was reading. So when I was very young, I read a lot of mysteries. So Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, all of those. And my very first books I wrote when I was probably 7 or 8 years old. And I used to write and illustrate books in these little notebooks, these Hilroy notebooks. And they were very much inspired by the Hardy Boys. They were these mysteries. But then soon I started upgrading to things like Stephen King. So for the longest time, I was really into Stephen King and I read a lot of his work. So I think, a lot that mystery element of what I used to read when I was very young has very much inspired a lot of the stuff that I like to write today. They're not necessarily mysteries, but there's usually an element of mystery or an element of the unknown. And I like that. And I think that Stephen King is such a great example of a storyteller. He could really tell any story and it'd be, so captivating. But I love how he is able to tell a story that can be so, ridiculously over the top and terrifying and horrifying. But then at the heart of it, it's always a very human story. Like it's always a story about people who are struggling with very universal things that we all struggle with. And all the mysterious elements help magnify that and amplify that. So I think he's really talented in that.
Thanks.
I love Stephen King. But I'm like, how does he write all these books? I mean, I'm like, he has to have a ghostwriter, but we won't go there.
Okay, my next question then, that's what you read when you were a kid. What's on your nightstand or your end table? What are you reading now?
Oh, so over this past year, I have been making a real effort to read outside of my comfort zone because I typically read books that are similar to After Elias, the books that I write. They're kind of contemporary fiction. They're very human stories, a lot of drama, a little bit of mystery. But right now I'm reading a fantasy. It's The Kingdom of Liars by Nick Martell. He's one of our 2020 debuts. So I've been reading a lot of things that I wouldn't normally read because I haven't read a lot of fantasy. I've been reading some historical fiction. I've been reading, types of books that I wouldn't normally pick up. I haven't decided what I'm going to read next, but it is, I have a pile of books, half of which are 2020 debuts because, Pamela and I have a group of fellow debuts and they've all written incredible books. So I want to go through those, not just to support them, but to read their work. So I have, a whole pile of those alone. So we'll see. I'll just have to, I usually decide on a whim. So as soon as I'm ready to start a new book, I just go with however I'm feeling at the time. So we'll see.
Okay.
We're getting some questions.
We are, well, okay, well, I want to ask mine first. And
Okay.
I always say this, if you haven't read the book yet, that's your own fault.
You had a whole month to do it. So.
Read it. I know this is the old teacher coming out. You were given the deadline, and it's okay if you didn't do it, but you might want to turn off now and pick it up because we're going to record this and it'll be available to you later. So, spoiler alert. My first question, I really want to know, why would Elias agree to go to Mexico to get married within driving distance of his family, who he was so secretive about and obviously detached from. Talk about that.
That's a great question. I don't think I've been asked that. And I've certainly thought through it. And I don't want to give a conclusive answer because, you know, I know this will probably drive you crazy, Susan. But I do want people to, there are so many questions unanswered in the book, and that was done deliberately, right? Because life, you don't always get the answers in life. And I like that element of being able to interpret things and imagine, you know, based on you as a reader, your understanding of the character, why would you think he would have done that? So I'm not going to turn the question around on you, Susan, but I will say that, you know, I think you reach a point where you've been resisting something for so long that you just stop caring. You know, you just can't, you don't have the emotional bandwidth to hold on any longer. And so I like to think that for Elias, who, you know, the previous, you know, number of years were governed by his feelings of guilt and his feelings of alienation, and him wanting to distance himself emotionally and physically from what he thinks is the source of these negative feelings, his family, his hometown in Mexico. I think he viewed the wedding as, you know, a way to usher in something new and something different. And I think that might have been part of his own healing process by, you know, not resisting any longer. So, like I said, I don't know because I'm not Elias.
I read it as the triggering, like that's what triggered him. See, okay, I'm not even, but I thought.
I'm going to jump in here and say that Pamela and I have discussed this book on the phone or texting more than any other book. And we've read some really good ones this year. And this one, I mean, she called me and she goes, first question was, did he do it? So
I'm honored. And that's exactly what I want to inspire, right? And that's why I don't like making it so black and white with answers. I want people to discuss and have their own opinions. And this is why I also don't really like giving conclusive answers, because, you know, Pamela, maybe you're right. Maybe that was the triggering event, right? Because trust me, I like, even writing this, I've thought through a lot of these different scenarios in terms of motivation and having different answers to these questions. So I wouldn't say there is one right answer, not even the one that I just voiced.
Okay.
All
right. My last question, then we'll get to the others, and I have others if we need backup questions. But okay, on that same vein, then why would Cohen decide to surprise Elias with his dream wedding venue, the first one that he came up with, the courtyard of the building where he tried to commit suicide, but that was the building where his rapist lived?
Yeah.
So
I don't know. Why do you think, Susan?
Borderline personality came to me at first. I was not making fun of it. I thought, okay, this guy there is a real problem here, that if he thinks he's going to get a fresh start and, you know, or he's going to make his hell no longer his hell.
That's a really good take. And I wouldn't say that's incorrect. This one is a little easier for me to answer because I think, you know, as the reader, you know Cohen more than you know Elias, right? Like, you have been given access to his head and his heart quite intimately. And even though you can't necessarily trust what he's thinking and saying all the time, what I hope is that readers have some level of understanding of who he is and why he would make the choices that he made. So for that instance, for me, I think that he wanted to believe his own delusions so strongly that what he thought it would be a good idea. Like, what he was fixated on was, this is where Elias and I met. Everything else was just noise. Everything else was just circumstantial. What it came down to is he and Elias met in that courtyard. So of course, it sounds like a perfect idea, right? To get married in the place where you met. And he wanted to believe this fantasy of, you know, them having this this magical meet cute on the rooftop of a building. Like he wanted to believe that, you know, there was no darkness involved, that it truly was this, you know, happy occasion. So by hosting the wedding there, it's almost another way of asserting it as his own reality, right? Like it's another way of him resisting the truth and kind of asserting his version of the truth of that day. So I think that's where he was coming from it. He was delusional for sure. And I think he just wanted to believe in that fantasy so badly that he thought that that would be a good idea.
Thank you. Because I was thinking maybe it was control, that he wanted control. And that didn't, I don't know. This book kept me up at night. Okay, but
yeah, I'm glad in a way. I know that you probably wanted to sleep at some point. You had mentioned that yesterday. But
pandemic, I'm retired. What am I going to do?
Yeah, you need sleep.
Sleep during the day.
But Susan, can I ask you? So what I just said, does that resonate with you? Like, do you see how that could be the case? And
very much.
Okay.
I can definitely see that. I just didn't know if it was a control or delusional. And I gave him the benefit of the doubt through so much of it. You know, he's going to recover. He's going to, be okay. But, the mental illness part of it, the trauma, kept surfacing in his behavior.
We didn't realize that he was mentally ill. I mean, I didn't go, he's mentally ill until the discovery that he had attempted to end his life. And that's when I was like, oh, okay. And then I questioned, why would Elias want to be involved with the man who did that? Like, why? Because that would be a very traumatic experience. I mean, I thought if I was there and that had happened, you want to talk about that, Eddy?
I
was gonna say, are you asking me, or is that a
I want to know.
question?
Pilots are usually very stable. So I hope opposites attract you.
Yeah. So I'm gonna share something, an anxiety that I had with this element of the book before I give you my answer, Pamela, because what I did not want was for Cohen's mental illness and his struggles with his mental illness to be seen as a plot twist or a surprise. And even though I wanted that effect in the reader, I wanted that moment to crystallize the reality for the reader, for them to truly understand, okay, like this makes sense now. I was really anxious with that being read as a plot twist because I didn't want to trivialize it in such a way. So what I wanted to do was to kind of leave, breadcrumbs along the way up until that point, so that, when it happened, you had a more true understanding of Cohen and his motivations. And I think for Elias, so, in the beginning, I think most readers would probably be led to believe that Elias is the one who's unstable. He's the one it's his sanity that's being questioned. And, he's the one who is being put under the microscope. And Cohen is just, the victim of what's happening, of this tragedy. But Elias is really the one who was the stable one. And I think, part of why Elias would be willing to, to kind of create that new relationship with Cohen, someone who's clearly troubled, I think is because Elias felt that there was an opportunity for him to help someone, to save someone, similar to, spoiler alert, related to how he, wasn't able to do that for his brother, something that has always haunted him. The guilt of that has always haunted him. Same to how he came across something very similar when he was living in Mexico City, and his friend Juan also died by murder, something that he couldn't prevent. This was his chance to save someone. So he saw someone in need of being helped and being saved. And I don't think he went into it thinking, I'm going to marry this man one day. I think he just wanted to be there for him. And I think to a certain extent, he could really relate the pain that Cohen was going through, and he wanted to be there for him. And then things, you know, escalate from there in terms of the human connection. So they both have very different traumas, but they're united in the fact that they do have that trauma. That's one thing that they share.
Yes. And I totally relate to that. You know, when you have a trauma or whatever, and you meet someone and it doesn't raise any red flags because it's like, oh, this feels very similar, so it's okay.
Yep.
You know, without oversharing. I'm not going to overshare.
I'm going to be oversharing.
Okay, Eddie will overshare. I'm just going to say that. We have a few questions. First one is from Peggy. She said, Eddie, were you a social worker before you were an author? You described the difficult situation of homelessness well.
No. And you know what? It's something that I've always considered. So I'm a very compassionate person. And that's not me bragging about that. It's just the truth. And I think that is as a writer, that definitely works to my advantage in that I like to write stories that kind of tap into humanity and the whole spectrum of how people feel, all the good and the bad and the ugly, but also the beautiful and the hopeful. And that's what I want to convey through my writing. But no, I was never a social worker. And I do believe that compassion is one of those things that is nurtured based on exposure. You know, like I think it's very easy for us to be insulated from others who have a different experience as we do. I think homelessness is one of the perfect examples of that, because we are quite literally living side by side with this whole segment of the population, right? So I can walk out on my street right now and walk past probably 5 different people living on the streets. And I think it's easy or easier for some people to do that and consider them as a different species or a different ilk. Maybe that's comforting. Maybe that is, I don't know what it might be, but I think, having that exposure really helps nurture that compassion and empathy, which is partially the reason why my best friend and I decided to start the Sidewalk Supper project, because back then, we hadn't had a lot of exposure to that crisis, and we hadn't had a lot of meaningful conversations with people in those situations. So it was as much of a learning experience and personal education for ourselves as it was for us trying to help those people.
Yeah.
Cool. You want to read the next one, Susan? My dog is like.
I see your dog. Dana's question. She says, I loved Elias' family story very much and the suspicion of him that is built into the plot. What inspired you to make him Mexican? Why was he so silent about his past with Cohen?
Ooh, okay. There are a lot of questions in there. So I'll start with Mexico. There are a couple of reasons. One is I love Mexico. It's one of my favorite countries. I've traveled there extensively. And one thing that I've always loved about the Mexican people is their attitudes towards death. They take something that we in North America consider as being very grim and dark and scary, and in a lot of ways they celebrate it. They make it beautiful. They have such a reverence for death, and you see this in their customs and how they remember those they've lost. And through a lot of my research, I've uncovered a lot of these different customs that come from both their indigenous cultures and their settled cultures. But one thing they share is this reverence for death. So with this book dealing with death in that way, Mexico felt like the right setting for it. Secondly, and actually one of the members of the Quarantine Book Club mentioned this in one of the questions that were posted. So she mentioned the juxtaposition between the Mexican setting and the beauty of the Mexican setting and the grimness of what Cohen was going through. And that was also an element that I really wanted to bring in. I wanted to tell a really sad, heartbreaking story in the most beautiful, bright place I could think of, to almost reflect, all the good and bad and dark and light, through the lens of the setting. So that's why I decided to set it in Mexico. The second part of the question was, sorry, about
Why was he so silent about his past with Cohen?
I think that was easier. So I actually feel okay giving a pretty conclusive answer about this one. And for me, it's because of guilt and resistance. I think, that's a coping mechanism for a lot of people. And I think I'm not, a scientist or sociologist, but I like to think, based on my experiences, that especially with men, this is very much, how a lot of men deal with really traumatic situations, is resisting it and ignoring it and denying it. And so I think that was how he chose to deal with it. And he took it to an extreme. So he not only, estranged himself from his family and his past and his home, but he also decided to do the same with everyone who was in his new life, because he couldn't face the guilt and all the other things that come with that by sharing that with his partner.
Okay, the next one is from Amber. As the author, do you feel you know the true Elias, or do you only know him through Cohen's perspective?
Ooh, that's a great question. Yeah, I really like that, because one of the decisions that I made early on before writing the book was, what perspective to write it in. And even though I thought that first person present tense might be a bit of a controversial and divisive decision, I thought I can't tell this story in any other way, because I need the reader to be to have intimate access to Cohen. I need the reader to be in his head and his heart. And as the writer, I felt like I had to do the same. So I truly inhabited his psyche for the multiple months that it took me to write the book, because I was telling the story through his eyes. I was also viewing everything through his eyes. So I would say that I certainly, I think like I do know Elias's character, because I think there are a lot of elements of who Elias is that I relate to. So there are pieces of myself that I see in him, and in the ways that he acts, and the ways that he thinks. And a lot of that wouldn't be evident in the story, because in the story you only get snippets of Elias, and you have to draw conclusions based on a very limited exposure to how he behaves and the things he says. So I think that I see him probably more clearly than a reader would. But certainly I don't understand him the way that I understand Cohen.
Okay, we've got one here, and I'm going to skip down a little bit because I had the same question. Marilyn must have been on my wavelength when we were reading this part. I just knew that the storm would have knocked the sign onto the rental car. How did you decide to let that destruction go?
Oh, interesting that was predicted. Susan, did you predict that as well when you're reading it? Yeah.
I thought, oh my God, not just the windshield wipers. Oh, and did his mom fix their windshield wipers? No, they didn't need them fixed. But the windshield wipers, and then the car gets crushed. That would have been perfect, or not.
Yeah, so I have I think my practical reasoning for that was I knew that they had to make it to Elias's home. So I didn't want to take away their means of making it. And I think I felt that if I were to put that obstacle, the car's gone, it's smashed to bits. They need to, hop on a bus or find some other way of getting there. It felt like it would have been more of a diversion than anything. Like it wouldn't have served the story. I felt at that point, I really wanted, I wanted them to get there. I didn't want to put another obstacle, because the windshield wipers, the storm, they've already encountered all these obstacles. So from like a practical storytelling perspective, I think that was my motivation. But then also more from like a thematic, I guess, perspective. Like that day kind of is a turning point, right? In a way, like it's a turning point in Cohen's understanding with his brother Clark, and vice versa. That's the beginning of the healing journey that they take together. So, you know, up to that point, everything has been going terribly. And that was the first positive thing to happen, right? They survived a storm, they didn't get struck by lightning, and they still have a car at the end of it. And I think, you know, for someone like Cohen, and I think there's a very human, this is very true with humans, we look for signs and things, right? Like we look for the external world to reaffirm how we're feeling and what we already think. So I think for Cohen, that was like affirmation that, okay, we can move on, like things are changing. So yeah.
Okay, the next question is from Dana. She said, the English couple and their garden was interesting to me. Have you developed this story in another work? It would make a nice story on its own. I'm curious where this idea came from and why you put it in this story.
Oh, that's great that, yeah, someone that kind of picked up on that and wanted to home in on that element, because I have a lot of love for it myself. I haven't, so that was imagined specifically for this book. And the reason that I did that was because I wanted to tell a story that was a collection of stories, a collection of, you know, real and imagined stories that help someone through a tragedy like the one that Cohen's going through. So, you know, when the tragedy strikes, Cohen ends up leaning on a lot of these stories for comfort. So, and understanding, not just comfort, sorry, I misspoke, more for understanding, to kind of understand how to, you know, deal with this. So you see stories from Aztec mythology, you see stories from Mexican folklore, you see stories from the people he meets, like Reina and her story, and others. So this was another story in a way. Like it was meant to almost be a way for Cohen to gain a bit of understanding about his own ideas of happiness and the fragility of happiness. And one thing that I really liked was, you know, as later on in the book, when Cohen is, you know, walking along the beach with Gabriel and he sees the house, you know, that's painted yellow on the beach where the prince and princess used to live. And what Gabriel says is, well, the islanders really love this house. They keep it alive. They paint it multiple times a year so that it's a reminder of the hope of love, but they let the garden die as a reminder of the fragility of love. And I thought that was just a really beautiful way to kind of capture these different elements of influences of Cohen's journey.
Okay, I have a question for you. What's the significance of Peter Pan?
Apart from the fact that I love Peter Pan, so Peter Pan is one of my, if I had to choose one story that is my favorite in life, it probably is Peter Pan. So you'll see like Peter Pan references sprinkled in a lot of stuff that I do. But for me, Peter Pan kind of represents the, I guess, innocence, you know, like the imagination and innocence that we all are born with, and most of us lose at some point in life. And I think Peter Pan is best represented by, spoiler alert, Elias's brother, Pedro, who ends up dying at a very young age. So in Elias's mind, you know, Peter Pan is Pedro. He's this boy who never got to grow up. And that, you know, that was just sort of a literary way of coping with that tragedy for Elias.
Okay.
You mentioned Reina, and Amber had another question. Is it a possibility that Reina is the princess from the island story?
Maybe.
Mm.
I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to say.
Why not?
I don't know.
Mm.
I think you're right, Amber.
I should just say I don't know. I actually don't. I don't know. Perhaps, yes.
But it could be.
Yep.
She could be.
Okay. We have another one. Okay, well, I can't see the questions right now. So I'm going to ask you, what do you wish, Eddy, that somebody would ask you about the book? Is there something that
what
you
do
would,
I wish?
what do you wish?
Yeah, like what is a question you've never been asked that you
Yeah.
wish someone...
Like, why don't people ever ask me something like this?
Oh, this is hard. Um,
It's a bonus.
You've stumped me, Susan. These are hard questions. I
Ooh,
guess. Huh. I've been asked a lot of questions. So it's
okay,
hard to
well, while you're
sort
thinking
through.
about that one, what's the best question that somebody's asked you about the book? That maybe you know something about your character or yourself that you didn't know.
I would probably say the question that I do get asked often, that I do like talking about, is the significance of Mexico in the setting. Partially because I think setting is such a powerful part of any story. Everything I write has a really strong sense of place, and there's always a reason behind it. And the island is a fictitious island, so I made it up. Like it's a figment of my imagination, but it's also inspired by a lot of real places that I love that exist in Mexico.
I did look it
So,
up. I was looking for it on a map.
oh yeah.
She's like,
where
I'm
is it?
booking
It's
a
not on
ticket.
Google Maps.
I want to go there. Where do you like to go in Mexico? Where
So
do
one of
you-
my favorite places is a town just outside of Mexico City. Well, not just outside, it's about 4 hours away from Mexico City, called San Miguel de Allende.
Oh,
And
bucket list.
have you been?
Oh,
Oh,
I have
gotta
friends.
go.
I was supposed to go last summer, but no, that's bucket list. Yeah, that's where Lainey
Amazing.
Cameron is.
That's right. Yeah, Lainey Cameron. I live vicariously through Lainey Cameron's
No, me too. The
Instagrams and her
city.
rooftop patio. That's like a writer's dream. But I love that. I love that place because it has this magical, ineffable quality that the best places in the world have, and it, in large part, actually inspired the island. So when I think of the island, I really wanted to capture that magical element. You know, hummingbirds just darting from flower to flower, and the cathedral bells just ringing in the distance. But then beyond that, just the people and their passion for art and beauty and for keeping things really beautiful and respecting their heritage and what they've gone through. A lot of the architecture in San Miguel is very colonial. So, you know, the Europeans came and they built much of what San Miguel is today. But then when Mexico gained independence, they kind of reclaimed that, like they reclaimed the rest of the country, and they even renamed the name of the town to honor someone who was involved in the revolution. So it's just such a great place of, you know, they preserve their history and they look forward to the future, and it's also just really beautiful. So I definitely recommend you going. And I also love Mexico City. It's one of my favorite, and I'm not exaggerating, it's one of my favorite cities in the world. I've been there a couple of times, and you know, my husband and I often think about moving there one day, retiring there. I think that's the dream. And for similar reasons, just such a, like, it's a thrilling place with such a love for art and beauty and culture. So yeah, lots of love for both of
Everybody
those.
say hi to Lainey. She's with us. She said,
Yeah, hi, Lainey.
Oh. Hey, Lainey. Lainey's so used to me talking about her present hometown, even though she's a digital nomad. That's her home right now. I think every time Lainey comes and do a talk with me, I probably bring it up at least once.
I've only been to Mexico for dental work. That's it.
"You
Oh,
just on the border." Oh no,
just across the border.
Baja.
Yes, I medical tourism. My husband has worked in Monterrey, Mexico, at the museum there a lot, but I've only been to get dental work because it was inexpensive. But maybe next year I'll be able to like travel to Mexico. So what is your relationship with grief? I mean, have you had a lot of experience with grief? Because that permeates this,
Yeah.
your whole book. And so I've written a lot about death and grief. And I'm just curious if you've had a lot of experience with death in your own life and grief.
Yes. Yeah, I have. And I think everyone has to an extent, you know, I would even say that what we've all experienced collectively over the past year with the pandemic and everything that we've lost, I mean, that was collective grieving, right? Like we were grieving everything that we've lost. So when it comes to loss, whether it's in the form of losing a loved one or losing an ideal or an idea or a sense of security, 100%. So, it'd be hard to write this story if it weren't informed by a personal experience. So without going into too much detail, I really wanted to tell a story about not just grief, but the process of losing something. And for Cohen, it's losing the man that he loves, but it's also him losing this idea of who he thinks he is, and this idea of what he thinks his life is, and the security that he's built over the years, the progress that he's made since the terrible trauma that he's experienced when he was younger. He loses all of that in an instant, and it really forces him to confront all the darkest parts of who he is internally. And that's certainly something that I can relate to.
We have one more question, and then we got to do our Amber asked, any chance of reunion of Cohen and Gabriel?
Maybe. I hope so. Yeah, that's another thing that I want to leave open-ended. I want people to imagine what would happen. And it's a standalone novel. There's no plans for a sequel. I don't think there needs to be one. Just know that their lives continue and they end up living either happily or unhappily. We may never know. But I do have, I do have ideas of where their lives would lead. And I don't know, this probably wasn't the question, but I do like to imagine that they would see each other again, that their last encounter wasn't the end of what they had.
So give us the elevator pitch for your next book that comes out.
The elevator pitch.
Yeah.
I'm not quite ready to let go of this first book. So I'm just starting to do events promoting my second book. I'm just I don't know if I'm ready because I'm not, it's such a shift. So I actually have it in front of me though. It's called The Rebellious Tide. This is an art. And it follows a complicated young man named Sebastian as he searches for his estranged father, the man he's never met. And that journey brings him to a ship in the Mediterranean that is holding a terrible secret. And it's a story about blame and obsession and belonging set on the Mediterranean Sea. It also features a really diverse cast of characters, people from different backgrounds and different cultures, different lives coming together. So yeah, I will say that it has a lot of similar elements as After Elias, but it's also very different in that I think After Elias is a very introspective story, and I'd say that The Rebellious Tide is a lot more it's a bit bolder in its storytelling. It has a lot more movement and action in a way, but still very much like a human story and a human-centered story about Sebastian and his life.
Is it twisty and turny, and are the big breadcrumbs any bigger in this?
Yeah, it's definitely
Big
twisty.
breadcrumbs.
It's definitely turny, and there are breadcrumbs.
Like slices of bread, not
Okay.
Loaves.
So this
Loaves of
is
bread.
Eddy's book, and we know lots of people have read it. And so I'm just going to mention this because I'm an author. Please write a review for Eddy, because it is so important that authors get reviews either on Amazon, Goodreads, BookBub, wherever you got it. If you can write a review, Barnes and Noble, because that's how books get discovered. And and it doesn't have to be like this, totally. It just has to be like, I really enjoyed this book. You should get it,
My review, I haven't written my review. I'm so sorry, but I'm going to. And I'm going to say it's the first book that I've ever read that addresses tiki bars. So it had tiki bars. I love tiki bars.
I mean, we could talk to you for so much
doesn't?
longer, because it's also the first book and I've read a lot of books that addresses male rape, and that you don't encounter in popular fiction. And I think it's something that needs to be written about. So thank you I really enjoyed this book, and Eddy's publisher is going to give away two different books to some of our members who took selfies with his book. So Amy and Nancy, we have the Wheel of Fortune now. I'm not even picking it out of a bag. It's like super, oh my gosh, look at this.
On.
Woo! Welcome to the Wheel of Fortune. Yay.
I
Okay.
thought it would just be like names, paper names in a hat, but this is much
That's what we
sicker.
did. We've been
That's
doing.
what we've done. Okay, so our first
Yay!
winner is Leslie Dutcher. Yay, Leslie. Okay, I'm
So
gonna write
Leslie,
this down.
you've won a really amazing book called Seven by Farzana Doctor. It's been receiving a lot of recognition and awards up here in Canada, especially. So I guess you want Leslie to send her information to you, Pamela, or?
Yes. If I'll ask, I do a post tomorrow where I'll ask that they send me their mailing address so that
Cool.
I'll give that to you.
Congrats,
All right, so who
Leslie.
is our next winner? This is so exciting. Dana Austin. Dana is like, she always.
Has Dana won before?
Oh, yes.
But she takes her picture. She
Yeah.
participates with us. She answers the questions. I love Dana. I love
Yeah,
her.
Dana, I think, has read every single book that we've done since, and next month is our 1-year anniversary of the book club. So,
Awesome.
yeah. So
Can I
Eddy,
just say,
thank
I
you.
want to thank everyone so much for supporting, especially Susan and Pamela. I really appreciate the support, especially being a debut author and just seeing the enthusiasm for everyone here about the book, posting your selfies, answering questions. It's really an author's dream. So just thank you all so much.
Oh, see? Yay, book clubs. They're so awesome. All right. Thank you, Eddy, for joining us. Thank you, Amy and Nancy Harrington with the Passionistas Project for doing all the behind the scenes stuff, tech stuff that I'm just totally inept at doing. And Susan, thank you so much for being my co-admin and helping me. I appreciate
Always.
it.
It's a joy.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Y'all at the tiki bar.
Yeah.
Have a Mai Tai.
Yes.
Hi from me. Yes. Okay. Bye, y'all.
Night.
See you.
Good night.